It begins with a detail buried deep in a 1953 Foreign Office memo, one that mentions a temporary advance group of British field observers sent east of Krakow, March 1941. No names, no operations listed, only an oblique reference to a unit that officially did not exist. That small group was part of MI6's Section D, a covert arm tasked with intelligence and sabotage in territories the British government publicly claimed they had little access to. Their mission was to quietly observe German buildup in Eastern Europe before the storm of war fully broke across the continent. By early 1941, German forces had tightened their grip on Poland, the Balkans, and the strategic routes leading toward the Soviet Union. Officially, Britain's reach into these regions was limited. Unofficially, MI6 had begun cultivating a network of agents and sympathizers, Poles, Czechs, Yugoslavs, and even a handful of German dissidents, willing to gather information at extraordinary personal risk. Almost none of their names survived the war. Many used aliases, while others were recorded only by radio call signs that would later vanish from the archives. The challenge was immense. The Gestapo and the Abwehr ran dense intelligence webs across Krakow, Warsaw, and the occupied Carpathian villages. Any whisper of collaboration with the British meant immediate execution. Still, MI6 believed the German eastward buildup would determine the future of Europe. They needed eyes inside the machinery of the Wehrmacht, eyes that could identify fuel depots, rail timings, division transfers, and any sign that Hitler was preparing the largest invasion the continent had ever seen. A diary entry from a Polish Home Army courier, dated April 12, 1941, offers a glimpse into the tension of these early missions. 2 Englishmen came again tonight. Quiet, serious men. One carried no weapon. He asked only for lists, stations, trains, new uniforms in the barracks. We burned the paper after reading. They thanked us and walked back into the fog as if becoming part of it. The courier never recorded their names, but MI6 documents later referred to the Krakow pair, believed to be among the first British field officers inside occupied Poland. Their work required constant movement. The agents often posed as railway clerks, farm laborers, or even displaced refugees. They traveled by night through forests and abandoned villages, exchanging coded messages stitched into clothing or hidden in the seams of German identity cards. Radio transmissions were kept brief, never more than 18 seconds, to avoid German signal triangulation. Sometimes the messages failed to reach London entirely, lost to weather, interference, or operators captured before they could complete their signals. But despite the chaos, the intelligence began to flow. By mid-May 1941, MI6 pieced together a picture of German preparations in the general government region. Fresh panzer divisions arriving near Rzeszów, new fuel depots carved into hillsides, and an unusual concentration of Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. Something significant was coming. The agents didn't know the full scale, they only saw fragments. But the fragments were enough. One report, marked Priority, Immediate, noted a sharp increase in rail traffic running eastward. Another described strange conversations overheard in a Krakow tavern frequented by German officers, mentioning the need for winter clothing and extended supply lines. MI6 analysts in London took note, though not all commanders were convinced. Some believed it could be misdirection. Others feared the intelligence was too thin to justify its implications. Then, suddenly, parts of the network went silent. In late May, an MI6 radio operator known only as Merrick reported that 2 of his couriers had failed to appear at a safe house outside Nowy-Sącz. Another message logged from Warsaw warned of Gestapo sweeps targeting suspected foreign agents. Whether the British operatives were compromised, or whether local collaborators were uncovered first, remains unclear. The files describing their disappearance were heavily redacted in post-war releases, leaving historians with questions that linger even today. Despite these losses, Section D's remaining agents pressed forward. They relayed troop estimates, fuel storage measurements, and Luftwaffe activity from improvised outposts. One of the final transmissions received before the German invasion of the Soviet Union came on June 20, 1941. It described mass movement of armor columns and logistics buildup nearing completion, language that analysts immediately flagged as critical. MI6 forwarded the warning to Moscow, but the Soviets dismissed it, certain that Germany would not break the non-aggression pact. 2 days later, Operation Barbarossa began. In the chaos of those early hours, the British agents scattered across Eastern Europe did what they could. Some fled, some joined partisan groups, and others vanished into the fog of war entirely. Their early intelligence helped Britain understand the magnitude of the offensive, though the cost of obtaining that information remains partly hidden behind classified files and missing field reports. As the dust settled, MI6 realized their work in Eastern Europe was only beginning. If the invasion could not be stopped, it still might be shaped, and the next mission would be even riskier. The stage was set for daring extractions, covert alliances, and operations where a single misstep could erase entire networks. And it all began with those first silent observers who slipped behind enemy lines in the spring of 1941, never knowing how few of them would live to see their work acknowledged. In the scattered archives of MI6, there is a single, understated request dated June 29, 1941, just 8 days after the launch of Operation Barbarossa. It reads, "Immediate consideration, recovery of British nationals and priority foreign assets from eastern territories now under German threat." Beneath the formal language was a desperate reality. Diplomats, scientists, and intelligence contacts trapped behind rapidly shifting front lines, at risk of falling into the hands of the Wehrmacht or worse, the Gestapo. It was the beginning of one of MI6's most dangerous undertakings, creating covert extraction routes across a continent suddenly in flames. As the German invasion tore across Eastern Europe, millions fled eastward. Amid that chaos, MI6 saw an opportunity to move quietly. Disguised as refugees, agricultural workers, or even Red Cross volunteers, British operatives slipped into occupied zones to make contact with individuals considered vital to the Allied war effort. Some were codebreakers. Others were economic advisors who knew the Wehrmacht's resource vulnerabilities. Several were diplomats who had witnessed early war crimes and carried information that Berlin wanted silenced. To navigate these operations, MI6 depended heavily on the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa AK. Still reeling from 2 years of brutal occupation, AK units possessed something the British lacked: intimate knowledge of the forests, villages, and rail networks threading Poland and the Western Soviet territories. The AK's shadow routes, known as Szlaki Przerzyto, became the arteries through which extractions would succeed or fail. One British officer, known in documents only as R. Hale, described these operations in a post-war testimony: "The Home Army men had nothing. No medicine, no warm coats, barely any ammunition. Yet they never turned us away. They walked at the front of our line every night, listening for German patrols." His words reveal the human core of these missions: courage born not of orders but survival. The struggle intensified as German security services tightened their grip. Patrols swept roads near Lwow and Białystok, and abandoned farmhouses, once reliable safe houses, were now watched or booby-trapped. Couriers carried forged Kennkarten identity papers at all times, but even the best forgeries could fail under close inspection. A single misplaced accent, a mismatched stamp, or a hesitation when asked about birthplace could mean immediate arrest. One particular extraction, recorded in AK files, illustrates the razor-thin margin for error. In August 1941, MI6 coordinated a mission to retrieve Dr. Samuel Glickman, a physicist who had fled Warsaw and was now hiding near a village south of Pinsk. German units had occupied the area, using local barns as temporary munitions depots. When the MI6 team finally reached him, Dr. Glickman refused to leave until they located his research notes, documents that included early observations on German fuel shortages. Retrieving the papers meant entering a German-guarded building under cover of night, counting patrol footsteps, and slipping past sentries who were sometimes only meters away. They succeeded, but barely. A German patrol discovered footprints in the mud the next morning and launched a manhunt. The British team vanished into the marshlands before the dogs and soldiers arrived. To this day, the escape route remains uncertain. Maps of the area describe only wetland crossing, high risk. Not every mission ended in success. MI6 logs list several teams that disappeared without explanation. In mid-September 1941, 2 agents known by their codenames Harper and Lynx departed from a safe house near Brest-Litovsk with a diplomat's daughter and an engineer valuable to the British war economy. They never reached the rendezvous point near the Bug River. Some historians speculate they were intercepted by German Feldgendarmerie units. Others suspect betrayal by a double agent embedded within a partisan group. Without recovered bodies or documents, the truth remains concealed behind silence. Through autumn 1941, the extraction routes grew more elaborate. AK guides used church bells or lantern signals to warn of German patrols. MI6 operatives learned to hide intelligence in the hollowed-out heels of boots or in the false bottoms of milk cans carried by local farmers. One agent even smuggled microfilm inside the wax seal of a wedding letter, a trick overlooked by German inspectors who considered personal mail trivial. Despite the ingenuity, MI6 faced a growing dilemma. With each successful extraction, German counterintelligence intensified its efforts, deploying informants, checkpoints, and decoy patrols. A senior MI6 officer wrote in a winter memo, "We are losing couriers faster than we can replace them." This was not hyperbole. The weather, the Gestapo, and exhaustion were as deadly as bullets. The network was being stretched to its breaking point. Yet the missions continued because the stakes were enormous. Every rescued scientist, diplomat, or resistance figure carried knowledge that shaped British strategy. Maps of German supply lines, evidence of mass executions, or technical insights into Axis resource shortages. These were not simply rescues, they were information lifelines. By late 1941, however, cracks began to appear. Radios went silent. Rendezvous points were abandoned. And across Eastern Europe, MI6 operatives whispered the same fear. Someone was giving their routes away. In London, a quiet investigation began, one that hinted at infiltration, either by German intelligence or by an unknown foreign service operating in the same shadows. Files from that inquiry remain partially classified, their redactions concealing names that might explain why entire teams never returned. As winter descended, MI6 prepared for another phase of operations. The extractions had proven their value, but they had also exposed a vulnerability. The network was now known, hunted, and possibly compromised from within. And as MI6 looked south toward Romania and the oil fields feeding Hitler's war machine, they realized the next mission would push secrecy and sacrifice to an even deeper level. In the months following the brutal winter of 1941-42, British intelligence analysts identified a single point of structural weakness in the German war machine: its desperate dependence on oil from Romania. Hidden behind dozens of classified MI6 memoranda was a simple truth: without the Ploiești oil fields, the German Wehrmacht could not sustain its sweeping offensives. And so, in early 1942, MI6 launched one of its most dangerous covert initiatives in Eastern Europe: a sabotage and reconnaissance campaign aimed at the heart of Romania's petroleum empire. The hook came from a coded message smuggled out of Bucharest by a Romanian railway accountant sympathetic to the Allies. The message read, "Production rising. Security lighter at night. New pipelines toward refinery district." These few lines would trigger a months-long series of clandestine operations involving British operatives, Romanian dissidents, and underground trade unionists opposed to the fascist government of Ion Antonescu. Their objective was not merely sabotage, but intelligence, mapping vulnerabilities, assessing fuel storage, and tracking the convoys carrying oil north toward the Eastern Front. The struggle began with MI6's infiltration into Romania's oil regions. Agents traveled under false identities as engineers, black market fuel traders, and in one unusual case, an inspector for a German-owned shipping company. Because Romania officially aligned itself with Germany, the nation was crawling with German security officers, Luftwaffe engineers, and Abwehr counterintelligence teams. Every depot was watched, every new worker scrutinized. Even local refinery employees were required to carry stamped permits detailing their daily movements. An MI6 operative known by the codename Kendall, posing as a Swiss chemical consultant, wrote in his field notes, "The Germans watch us like wolves. Every barrel, every hose, every valve is guarded as if a single spark could cost them the war." Perhaps it could. Kendall's team would later map 14 pipeline routes, identify several critical choke points, and send back detailed sketches of depots and pump stations, all without the protection of an established resistance network. Yet it was precisely the arrival of the British that created new tensions. Romania's underground was deeply divided, split between nationalist groups, communist factions aligned with Moscow, and remnants of older liberal movements. MI6 needed them, but trust was fragile, and information was a currency exchanged somewhere between cooperation and suspicion. One of the first major meetings between MI6 and local anti-fascist leaders took place in a cramped apartment above a tailor shop in Bucharest. Present were 3 Romanians and a single British handler known only as Adler. He carried with him British radio components and microfilm casings for document photography. According to later testimonies, the atmosphere was tense. The Romanians suspected the British might abandon them if the political winds changed. The British feared infiltration by German informants or communist cells reporting back to Moscow. The insight that changed the course of the mission came from a railway worker in the city of Ploiești, who revealed that German engineers had begun inspecting hillside caverns outside the city, natural formations being converted into fuel storage bunkers. If Germany succeeded, these underground sites would be far harder to bomb than the surface refineries. MI6 recognized the urgency. They needed to document these new structures before they became operational. But the reveal came with a cost. The very night after the intelligence reached the British, one of their operatives vanished. The missing agent was Harwood, a logistics specialist with engineering training. He had gone to meet a contact near Piazza Romana and failed to return. When MI6 searched his rented room, they found his coded notebook missing and his radio transmitter partially disassembled. Romanian security forces claimed ignorance. The Gestapo denied involvement. But the local resistance whispered that Harwood had been betrayed by someone present at the meeting in the tailor shop, a person who might have been working for the Abwehr from the very beginning. For modern historians, the disappearance of Harwood remains one of the most intriguing loose threads of MI6's wartime operations. Some recently declassified fragments suggest he may have been taken to a holding site near the Doftana River. Others hint that the Soviets, eager to control post-war Romania, may have captured him for their own intelligence goals. No definitive evidence has ever surfaced. Despite the loss, MI6 could not abandon the mission. Sabotage attempts began quietly. Local dissidents tampered with gauges, replaced valve components with defective ones, and introduced impurities into fuel lines. Sabotage had to be subtle. Anything too dramatic would expose the network. A misaligned valve here, a delayed delivery there. Minor disruptions that, over time, forced German engineers to spend precious weeks repairing systems while the front demanded more fuel than ever. By late 1942, however, the stakes rose dramatically. The British prepared a full intelligence package for future Allied bombing plans, one that required close-range photographic evidence of Germany's fortified fuel sites. It meant placing operatives directly inside the industrial zones, where the slightest misstep could lead to instant arrest. The partisans agreed to help, but with conditions. They feared another betrayal. The British feared another disappearance. And as the winter of 1942 approached, both sides understood that Ploiești was no longer just a strategic target. Its labyrinth of pipes, caverns, and guard posts had become a battlefield of shadows. A single spark at the wrong moment could destroy lives, missions, or the fragile alliances keeping them afloat. The next chapter of MI6's work in Eastern Europe would take them into Hungary, where the war was shifting, the stakes growing, and the danger becoming even sharper. Hidden inside a small batch of Hungarian state railway documents confiscated in 1946 is a curious annotation. Next to a list of freight schedules, a British interrogator scribbled, "Possible MI6 insertion point, Budapest Cipher Group, 1943?" This brief note hints at a little-known chapter of the Allied intelligence war, the quiet, highly technical battle waged in the heart of Hungary, where MI6 embedded codebreakers, radio specialists, and undercover couriers to intercept Axis communications at the moment Germany tightened its grip over the region. The story begins in early 1943, when British analysts noticed an unusual pattern in German railway logistics. Trains carrying munitions, fuel, and heavy equipment were being rerouted through Hungarian territory in increasingly irregular intervals. The shift suggested that Germany was repositioning key divisions for operations either in the Balkans or the collapsing Eastern Front. But without precise records, shipment numbers, destinations, rail capacities, MI6 could not determine the Wehrmacht's strategic intent. The struggle took shape as MI6 dispatched its cipher specialists into Budapest under a variety of civilian covers. One operative, known as Fletcher, posed as a representative for a Swiss agricultural equipment firm. Another adopted the identity of a French clerk displaced by the fighting. Their objective was delicate and dangerous: collect railway codes, decipher German teleprinter traffic, and intercept transit logs from the MI6, Hungary's state railway authority, without attracting the attention of German security advisors embedded within the Hungarian government. Budapest in 1943 was a city alive with tension. German influence grew daily, and Hungarian Arrow Cross sympathizers patrolled the streets. The cafés were filled with suspicion, and the Danube embankments echoed each night with curfews and patrol boots. In this atmosphere, MI6's cipher team rented an inconspicuous room above a cobbler's workshop near Nagati railway station. From this cramped, dim-lit space, they monitored railway communications through discreetly placed wiretaps installed with the help of two Hungarian telegraph employees sympathetic to the Allies. A diary entry from one of the Hungarian collaborators, discovered decades later, adds a human dimension to the operation. The Englishman, he speaks little Hungarian, but his eyes are never still. He listens to every sound. When we work on the wires, he removes his hat and whispers something, I think a prayer. The man he described was likely Fletcher, who led the effort to decipher cargo movements and troop deployments. The insight they sought came gradually through fragments. Teleprinter bursts listing armored divisions, coded symbols denoting heavy artillery, and maintenance directives for panzer trains heading east. MI6 analysts in London pieced these signals together, realizing that Germany was quietly shifting units to reinforce collapsing lines near Kharkov and the Donetsk basin. The British needed confirmation and timing before sharing intelligence with the Soviets, whose trust in Western information was fragile at best. But as MI6 tightened its net, the danger escalated. In March 1943, a German liaison officer stationed in Budapest reported irregularities in the railway communication logs. Someone had been copying codebooks, or possibly reading restricted transmissions. Although he lacked proof, his suspicion was enough to trigger joint Abwehr Aero cross sweeps through Budapest's administrative districts. The reveal struck suddenly. One morning after a routine data retrieval, a Hungarian telegraph operator working with the British failed to return home. His wife reported seeing unfamiliar men waiting in the stairwell of their building earlier that day. MI6 operatives immediately changed safe houses and destroyed their duplicate code sheets. For the rest of the month, they lived in near silence, transmitting only the most essential intelligence through dead drops scattered across the city. The tension reached its peak with a narrow escape later described in post-war MI6 summaries. A German patrol unexpectedly searched the cobbler's shop beneath their hideout. Forced to evacuate, Fletcher and his team dismantled their radio equipment in under 4 minutes, stuffed their papers into sacks of leather scraps, and slipped out through a courtyard that led to a neighboring tenement. They moved across rooftops as patrols shouted below, the cold spring air carrying the sound of dogs barking along the Danube. By sunrise, they reached a new safe house on the Buda side of the city, shaken but intact. The application of their work, decoding German transport shifts, proved critical. In April 1943, MI6 intercepted a series of messages indicating that German SS motorized units were preparing to reinforce anti-partisan operations in the Balkans. This intelligence allowed British operatives in Yugoslavia to warn the resistance early, saving countless lives. But mistrust within the network deepened. The disappearance of the Hungarian telegraph operator led many to suspect an informant was operating inside one of the resistance cells. British officers debated whether the leak came from a German sympathizer or from a small communist faction aligned with Moscow, which viewed British intelligence with suspicion. The archives remained silent on the matter, but the timing of arrests confirmed that someone had tipped off the authorities. The close of this chapter came in June 1943, when MI6 made the difficult decision to extract its cipher team from Budapest. The risk of total compromise had grown too high. Under cover of a nighttime cargo shipment, the operatives boarded a barge on the Danube arranged by Hungarian railroad workers. They drifted upriver under blankets and sacks of coal, avoiding German river patrols by inches. One patrol boat passed so close that Fletcher later recalled hearing the officer's cigarette ash falling into the water. By dawn, the team was gone, safely spirited toward a partisan outpost near Visegrad. But their work had laid the foundation for the next phase of MI6 activity, one that would involve deeper alliances, sharper political risks, and the shifting lines of power as the Soviets advanced westward. And it was in Poland, under the shadow of both German retreat and Soviet ascendancy, that the next secret mission and its tragic mystery would begin. There is a small, typewritten memorandum housed in the Imperial War Museum's closed files section. Dated September 1944, it reads, Soviet advance accelerating. German withdrawals imminent. MI6 to secure intelligence through partisan intermediaries, priority Eastern Poland. The note looks routine, almost bureaucratic. But it marked the beginning of one of the most complex and perilous MI6 efforts in the war's final year, establishing cooperation with partisan groups across eastern Poland as the Red Army pushed west and German forces began their chaotic retreat. The hook came from the shifting front lines. By summer 1944, the Wehrmacht was collapsing across Belarus and the Vistula corridor, leaving behind abandoned command posts, supply depots and field headquarters. These sites contained invaluable intelligence, maps of retreat routes, evidence of burn orders and documentation of atrocities committed during German occupation. MI6 knew that the first forces to reach these positions, partisans, civilians or Soviet reconnaissance units, would determine what information survived. The struggle lay in the fractured nature of the territory. Eastern Poland in 1944 was a labyrinth of armed factions. The Polish Home Army AK remained loyal to the government in exile in London. The Soviet-backed Armia WWII, held separate allegiances. Ukrainian partisan groups operated independently, sometimes hostile to both. German security forces prowled the forests, still lethal even during retreat. Into this dangerous landscape, MI6 inserted small liaison teams tasked with negotiating cooperation, securing intelligence, and preventing sensitive material from falling exclusively into Soviet hands. One MI6 team was dispatched to a wooded region near Lublin in August 1944. The group consisted of 3 British officers, codenamed Mason, Ridgewell, and Sable, and 2 Polish couriers from the AK. They carried radios, medical supplies, gold sovereigns for negotiation, and a list of known partisan contacts believed friendly to the British cause. Their objective was to establish a joint intelligence sharing agreement. Any German documents recovered by local partisans would be duplicated and sent to MI6 before delivery to the Soviets. A field journal kept by one of the AK couriers survives, its pages waterlogged but legible. The Englishmen carry themselves with calm. They trust us perhaps too much. They do not understand how dangerous it is to walk these forests with so many enemies wearing no uniform. The entry captures the uncertainty clouding every negotiation. Nothing in eastern Poland was simple. Every agreement carried shadows behind it. The insight that reshaped MI6's operations came from one of the first partisan meetings. A local commander, identified in British notes only as Baruta, revealed that German rear units were burning supply records and executing forced laborers as they withdrew. He urged the British to act quickly. If you want your documents, you must reach the depots before the Soviets. Once they come, all is chaos. Baruta provided maps to 2 abandoned German headquarters near Chelm, including details on where officers stored meteorological logs, fuel reports, and prisoner lists, high-value intelligence. With this new information, MI6 prepared a coordinated move with AK fighters. But the reveal of growing tensions within the partisans was impossible to ignore. The Armia Ludowa, backed by Soviet political officers, opposed British involvement entirely. They accused the AK of cooperating with imperialist agents, and several confrontations between the factions nearly escalated into firefights. MI6 officers soon found themselves cautiously navigating not only German patrols but also the delicate, often hostile dynamic between partisan groups. One episode described in post-war testimonies illustrates the danger. An MI6 negotiation team arranged a nighttime meeting with a local partisan detachment near the village of Sosnowica, a group believed to be sympathetic to the Allies. The British arrived at the rendezvous point. The partisans never showed. Instead, the forest grew silent, so still that even the insects seemed absent. Mason later reported that he sensed the woods were listening. The team withdrew carefully, convinced the meeting had been compromised. The next day, a disturbing development surfaced. A nearby partisan commander reported seeing German Feldgendarmerie units moving through the very forest where the meeting was supposed to occur. Someone, either from a rival partisan faction or an informant embedded within one, had tipped off the Germans. The British realized their presence was no longer a secret. Then came the disappearance. On September 18, 1944, Mason, Ridgewell, Sable, and their AK guides entered a dense stretch of forest near Lublin to attend a follow-up meeting with Baruta's men. It was a routine operation, one they had performed multiple times. They carried standard equipment, ration packs, and a small radio to signal extraction if needed. They were expected to return by dawn. They never did. At first, MI6 assumed they were delayed or forced into hiding by German patrols. But days passed with no signal. The AK searched abandoned bunkers, forest shelters, and river crossings. No bodies were found. No equipment. Not even footprints. The AL denied any involvement. The Soviets offered no assistance. German records from the area were incomplete, with nothing noting captured British personnel. A few local villagers claimed they heard gunfire that night. Others whispered that the British team had walked into a trap, set not by Germans, but by a partisan commander competing for influence in the shifting political landscape. Decades later, MI6 declassified a fragment of the internal report. Subject group presumed lost. Cause undetermined. Potential hostile partisan action cannot be excluded. The absence of certainty has kept the mystery alive. As the war neared its end, MI6 still needed intelligence, and the chaos of retreating German forces offered opportunities and dangers in equal measure. The next and final phase of their Eastern European operations would push deeper into contested territory, where the truth of war crimes, fleeing officials, and conflicting Allied interests collided. Part 6 would reveal how MI6 raced not only against time, but against their own uneasy allies. In a heavily redacted MI6 post-war assessment, one chilling sentence appears without explanation. In the final months, control of information became more dangerous than the front itself. It refers to the winter of 1944-45, when German occupation in Eastern Europe was unraveling, Soviet forces surged westward, and MI6 launched its final covert missions to document war crimes, locate fleeing Nazi officials, and secure intelligence before it vanished into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. The hook began with the liberation of key Polish and Baltic territories. As the Red Army broke through German lines, abandoned headquarters, makeshift prisons and burned-out command posts littered the landscape. These sites contained evidence vital to future prosecutions. SS execution orders, police battalion logs and deportation lists from ghettos that had been liquidated months earlier. MI6 understood that whoever first controlled this material would shape both wartime strategy and post-war narratives. And with tensions already rising between Britain and the Soviet Union, time became an enemy. The struggle was threefold. First, MI6 teams had to navigate regions where German rear units, though retreating, remained deadly. Second, they needed to work discreetly in areas now under Soviet military administration, territory where British clandestine operations were increasingly unwelcome. Third, they had to rely on local resistance fighters, many of whom distrusted each other, and some of whom feared Soviet reprisals more than German bullets. One MI6 officer, codenamed Ashford, led an intelligence group tasked with intercepting fleeing Nazi civil administrators moving westward through East Prussia. These officials often carried documents proving their roles in deportations, forced labor, and mass executions. Ashford's team followed whisper networks through refugee caravans, listening for mentions of Leitstelle agents, or district governors trying to escape before Soviet or British investigators could detain them. An excerpt from a Home Army message sent to MI6 in January 1945 conveys the tense atmosphere. SS units burning everything. Civilians fleeing in panic. Germans shooting their own men for retreating. The message ended with a request for immediate extraction of partisan leaders who had uncovered a cache of documents near Otwock, materials containing lists of ghetto transports, prisoner movements, and liquidation orders. MI6 arranged an emergency transfer point with the help of Polish couriers, using a hay cart equipped with a hidden compartment to smuggle the records out before the Soviets reached the site. But insight soon collided with geopolitical reality. Though Britain and the USSR were allies, their intelligence objectives diverged sharply by 1945. The Soviets sought to control all post-liberation documentation, much of which they intended to use for both war crimes trials and political leverage in reshaping Eastern Europe. MI6, wary of Soviet intentions, struggled to secure copies of key evidence before Red Army political officers seized everything. In several cases, British agents arrived at abandoned German offices only minutes before NKVD units took over. This friction became especially undeniable in February 1945, when MI6 attempted to document atrocities committed by German units retreating through northern Poland. British agents reached a series of abandoned SS field posts containing incomplete execution rosters and interrogation reports. But before they could transmit their findings, Soviet security forces arrived and requested that all foreign personnel hand over documents. MI6 complied publicly. Unbeknownst to the Soviets, microfilm copies had already been hidden inside the lining of a courier's boots. The reveal came not from enemy forces, but from a persistent rumor that began circulating among local partisans. Someone was hunting MI6 teams specifically to capture the intelligence they carried. The whisper pointed not to the Germans, they were too busy fleeing, but to unknown actors in the rapidly shifting power vacuum. Some suspected Soviet-backed partisan factions. Others blamed rogue elements of the Armia Ludowa seeking political advantage. The truth remains obscured by redacted files and missing field reports. The danger was not hypothetical. In March 1945, an MI6 group operating near Lodz vanished after attempting to interview witnesses from a recently liberated labor camp. Their last transmission mentioned Soviet patrols approaching, and local fighters requesting we leave immediately. Nothing more was heard. Soviet records made no mention of an arrest. German forces had already withdrawn. The disappearance remains one of the most contested incidents of late-war intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. MI6's final major task involved tracking high-ranking German officials attempting to flee through Czechoslovakia and Austria. British intelligence believed that several SS administrators, carrying incriminating files, were moving along refugee routes disguised as civilians. MI6 operatives embedded themselves along the mountain passes, intercepting couriers, bribing border guards, and sifting through convoys of terrified families. They recovered scattered documents, including partial lists of extermination camp personnel and directives for last-ditch scorched earth tactics. Yet each success deepened the growing tension with Soviet units operating in the same regions. When MI6 attempted to pass some of the recovered material to British High Command, Soviet liaisons complained that foreign interference threatened their operations. British diplomats downplayed the dispute, but MI6 officers in the field noted increasingly hostile encounters. The application of these missions, preserving evidence before it vanished, became clear only after the war. Some of the documents recovered by MI6 contributed to early Allied war crimes tribunals. Others informed intelligence assessments of emerging Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. A handful remain classified, their significance hinted at only by vague descriptions in archival summaries. The close of MI6's Eastern European operations came in late April 1945, when the last British field units were ordered to withdraw. Their final radio message, sent from a safe house near Brno, read simply, "Mission complete. Final files secured. Departing." It was a restrained conclusion to years of covert activity marked by sacrifice, improvisation, and the constant fear of vanishing as so many operatives had. But even as their missions ended, the tension lingered. Many MI6 reports from 1944 to 45 remain partially withheld, their redactions covering more than names, possibly entire chapters of wartime cooperation, betrayal, or political maneuvering. The mystery endures. What intelligence was too sensitive to reveal? And who, exactly, decided what history would remember? The war was ending. The secrecy was not.